I got my tea and it's raining outside. It was 80 degrees out yesterday and it is 59 today. Which is why I finally get to pull out my sweater. Yeah! So for those of you who don't really know me and who I am, which is probably most of you watching my videos at this point, I am a music teacher. I've taught music in the past and I went to school for music education, specifically in choral music education and piano pedagogy, which is just teaching people how to play piano. But, of course, when I went through my music education requirements, some of the classes that I have to take are, of course, music history. Because when you have to take music education courses, you have to take music history courses. And the music history courses ended up being among some of my favorite out of all the courses that I had to take while I was in college. But if you like classical music and were anything like how I was when I first started out my college years, you might be thinking, well, I like music history, sure, but there's a few specific eras or there's a few specific pieces that are way too unusual or way too weird for me. And I thought the same thing, so I'm not going to judge you too hard if you think that, or you have thought that in the past, or you currently think that, or you're thinking about that, or... Because I felt that way myself. And while I won't say that my opinions on that music has necessarily changed in terms of how I like to listen to it, I do understand it and appreciate it more now that I've kind of understood the context behind why it was written and how it came into place. So today I decided I would take 5 classical music pieces that were really weird or stood out to me in a way, or were pieces that I might not have really understood had it not been for my music history courses that I had to take. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, just as I said I didn't necessarily like certain classical musical pieces, even after listening to them and understanding them, I still didn't like listening to them very much. The same can be said of many experts in the musical field. Just because these kinds of weird pieces are out there does not necessarily mean that all classical musicians love hearing them and love listening to them all the time. And yes, how did you know I love to listen to 12-tone music every single day and night? Because most of the time that's not the case. Some of them are there for more academic purposes and their history and the contributions into the innovations that they made later on to some other kind of genre of music. But it's not necessarily the case that all musicians like listening to this music. Music, just like other forms of art, can have a contribution other than just beauty and aesthetics. In fact, when my class asked my music history professor this kind of question of, do you like listening to this music? He kind of responded similarly in just being like, just because I teach it doesn't mean I like it. But you know, the importance of these kinds of pieces can be interesting to learn and gives you more insight into understanding why other pieces of music came into play or why other pieces were written. So I'm going to start off this list by going oldest to newest, but funnily enough, as I wrote up this list, I also realized it coincidentally put itself into most tame to the weirdest of the bunch. So we're going to kind of go through it in that order. Not that I like any one of these more than the others, although some I do like listening to more than others. But we're just going to go through it from oldest to newest. So, starting off with number 1 is probably one you've heard of before, but may not necessarily understand why it was written. And that would be Symphony number 94, written by Franz Joseph Haydn in 1791, otherwise known as the Surprise Symphony. You've probably heard this song before. It's a pretty well-known symphony written by a really well-known composer. But why was it written? So for those of you who maybe haven't heard this piece, the most famous part of the symphony is the second movement, which is nice and slow and gentle until all of a sudden it hits this, it just plays this really loud chord all of a sudden, and it surprises you and shocks you, hence the name, the Surprise Symphony. Not the official title, just one people have kind of given it over time. But why did Haydn write this in his music? Well, the key to understanding this is to really understand the composer himself. If you really don't know anything about Franz Joseph Haydn, you should know this one little thing. Haydn was a mean lord. I genuinely mean that in the most serious of terms. He was known for being a prankster, he was known for playing jokes, he was known for just being this lovable, laughable guy who just had a great sense of humor. And people loved him for that. In fact, he was often known by the nickname Papa Haydn, because many people looked up to him as kind of like a little father figure, but like the father figure that would play a lot of practical jokes and had an interesting sense of humor. So understanding that he was kind of a little bit of a jokester makes more sense as to why he'd write something like this in his music. But it does go beyond that. Now, one thing I do want to address is many people believe that this piece was written in order to wake up the audience or to wake up his performers that were falling asleep. And I believe this too, actually, until literally just doing the research for this video. I thought that was maybe the reason why he had written it. Turns out, it's not the case. Sad to say, wah wah. I wish it was the case too, because it would be really funny. And it makes sense because it kind of sounds like something Haydn would do himself. But unfortunately, it's not quite the case. Although the real reason why is not too far off from that. In fact, Haydn was asked a specific question by a biographer during his time, who asked him, did you write this music? Did you write this piece to kind of wake up your audiences? And Haydn responded, no. But I was interested in surprising the public with something new and in making a brilliant debut so that my student Pleyel, who was at that time engaged by an orchestra in London in 1792 and whose concerts had opened a week before mine, should not outdo me. The first Allegro of my symphony had already met with countless bravos, but the enthusiasm reached its highest peak at the Andante with the drum stroke. That's the surprise part of the surprise symphony. Encore, encore sounded in every throat, and Pleyel himself complimented me on my idea. So it was kind of a thing that was added at the last second. In fact, it wasn't even in the original manuscript. He kind of decided to put in this surprise in the middle of the second movement. And not only that, but he did this to kind of outdo one of his students just because he had had a performance the week before. Yeah, that sounds like something Haydn would probably do. So moving on to piece number 2 is a piece by composer Erik Satie, which you probably know from songs such as and the second one is his piece, pardon my literal French here, I'm hoping I pronounce this correctly, Embryons, desséchés. I think I said that correctly. Which basically means desecrated embryos. Yeah, that's where the weird part comes in with this piece, is it actually doesn't sound that bad. It's more the title that makes this one really weird and really interesting. Because even though the rest of us usually know Satie for his beautiful impressionistic music, he also wrote quite a bit of other types of songs that were parody works. So this piece is broken into 3 small movements, all of which are various sea creatures. So we're looking at the desecrated embryos of 3 different sea creatures. And he's kind of describing the characteristics of each of the sea creatures in this piece. So the unique thing about this piece in particular is if you look at the music, there is also a lot of commentary, of course, in French, a lot of commentary about the various sea creature he's describing. Some of the movements will just more so make a parody of like whatever work he's trying to commentate on and not really say anything about the embryo or the desecrated embryo of the sea creature he put in the title, while other ones actually do make more of a direct connection. For example, in the first movement, he talks about the Holothurian, I think that's how you say it. He talks about the Holothurian, but then kind of makes a parody of the song, oh geez, more French, okay. Mon rocher de Saint-Malo. So this piece is a salon composition, which means it's probably one you'd see people play like in their home, like a very common, well-known song, kind of like Oh Susanna, or why is that the only song I can think of right now? I don't know. And he kind of makes fun of that piece and makes little notes of it every now and then, and even though it really has nothing to do with the sea creature he originally put. However, on the other end, in the second movement, he talks about this creature and says it has underdog-like qualities, describing it as subdued and morose. Meanwhile, he parodies Chopin's Funeral March, Piano Sonata No. 2 in B-flat minor, while calling it a mazurka by Schubert, except that Schubert didn't write mazurkas. Chopin did, because it's a Polish song, and Chopin is Polish and Schubert is not. So in this movement, it seems he's trying to kind of poke fun at Chopin's works and kind of his funeral march and the somberness of it, and just trying to make like I said, a parody of this song. But then comes the third movement, which is probably honestly my favorite of the three, and that is of the Podophthalma, which he claims has hunter-like qualities. And so sure enough, Satie writes a song that many would consider to sound kind of like a hunting song. It's got like that galloping sound of maybe like the horses and people chasing after each other. You kind of know the sound if you've ever heard like the overture to William Tell, for example. However, the best part of this whole song is when he parodies Beethoven at the very end of it. Now, if you've played any of Beethoven's music, or if you're familiar with any of his works, you will know that Beethoven is famous for his never-ending codas of just dun 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 dun. So Satie makes fun of that in this hunting song at the very, very end by just having this cadenza that goes on and on and on and on, and just when you think it's done, it keeps on going, and then no, it keeps going, and it keeps going, and it keeps going, and it keeps going, and moving on to number 3, we have The Banshee by Henry Cowell, written in 1925. Now, this piece is really cool if you haven't given it a listen before. It's definitely the kind of piece I would turn on around Halloween because it's got this really creepy, spooky sound. Hence why it's called The Banshee, of course. Now, the really unique thing about this piece is the way it's performed. It requires 2 performers at one giant grand piano, and it works better on a grand piano rather than, say, like an upright piano, because you have to have access to the strings to actually be able to touch the strings. And the way it works is one person sits at the bench and presses down the sustain pedal or the damper pedal, which will essentially take all of the pads that hold down the strings and stop the sound from continuing vibrating, and lift them all up so that whatever you do to the strings, the sound will just keep going until the string has run out of energy to continue making sound. And from there, the performer will lay their music inside the piano and will find the strings that they need to produce the music, and will scratch on the strings, or maybe hit the strings in a certain way, or maybe pluck the strings in a certain way, depending on what's written in the music. I've not actually performed this myself, but it's a really unique take on what a performer can do with the piano. You're no longer just playing the piano with the keys that hit the hammers that make the sound. Now you're going around to the other side of the piano and you're finding what new sounds can you make with these strings that you have in front of you. When you scratch them, it makes this eerie kind of like echoey, screechy sound. When you hit them and you pluck them in a certain way, it creates a completely different kind of sound than when you just play them with your hammer. And of course, by having the sustain pedal pressing down, these sounds just continue going so that all these eerie sounds just start to meld together and overlap one another and just make this great cacophony of all this creepy, banshee noises. And this piece really helped other composers further down the road to start thinking about new ways they could innovate with other instruments. You know, now if a piano is no longer just hitting the strings, what else can it be? Now it kind of allows you to think about what other creative ways can I use other various instruments. Piece number 4 is a very infamous piece. It's very well known amongst many classical musicians, and nowadays it's used more of a joke than anything else, but it did have some actual purpose when it first was initially written, and that is John Cage's 433. Now, if you don't know this piece, and you've never heard this piece before, and you go to see a performance of this piece, the first thing is you're probably going to be very confused, because what it is a piece that lasts 4 minutes and 33 seconds and involves the performers of any kind. It can be literally any performer of anything, standing on stage in the position as if they're going to play in complete silence for that entire period of time. But this idea didn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like some guy sat down and thought, wouldn't it be funny if I wrote a piece where everything was silent, ha ha ha. Because if you knew how John Cage actually studied and what his interests were and where he did a lot of his composing, it starts to make more sense. See, John Cage did a lot of work in serialist music, which is very different than most forms of music that you'll encounter, because it tends to be very methodical in its approach. There's not really any keys, there's not really any tone center, there's not really anything at all other than a method of composing music. It originally started off with 12-tone music, where you would take each of the 12 tones that exist within Western music, and you would use each of them once in one time in a very specific pattern that you created before you would even think to repeat another note again. But of course, this extended just beyond 12-tone music and started extending into, well, maybe we should do this with rhythm, or maybe we should do this with just any aspect of the music. And it really started to just become this specific method that you would create of how you would write your music. Now, John Cage's method was really unique compared to most other serialist music because he liked to use chance in his composing, which just kind of meant he would sometimes quite literally roll dice to determine what the next note was going to be, what the duration of the note was going to be, and what octave that note was going to be in. But of course, that doesn't really relate too much to 433. So how did 433 come along? The way it specifically applies to 433 is the idea of, what if we left the music kind of to random chance by having it be complete silence? With the idea being that, well, if notes are an important part to music, and the space between the notes are just as an important part of music, what if we wrote a piece that was just the space between music? So then what that means is, when you listen to 433, yes, the performers are in complete silence, but then what becomes the music? Well, the room that you're in is not completely silent. There's still sounds going on. Nobody's sitting there completely still, not moving a single muscle. Usually there's some kinds of sounds. People rustling around in their seats, the shuffling of the papers for the programs, and there's always at least one person coughing in an audience. And suddenly, that kind of becomes the music. But it does leave a very interesting discussion to be held. Most people would often go, well, this can't be considered music. But then it makes you think, well, why can't it be considered music? Is it because it's not pitched? Because percussion's often not pitched, and we still consider that music? And then stuff like this often makes you think, well, what defines the boundaries of music? And then, can this be considered music? Can this not be considered music? That's mostly up for the people to discuss and decide. But speaking about the boundaries of what's considered music, we have possibly the weirdest piece in terms of classical music, or maybe any genre of music ever, and that is the Helikopter-Quartett by Karl Heinz Stockhausen recorded and performed in 1995. Yes, the Helikopter-Quartett. Why? Because there's helicopters in it. No, seriously. This is one you definitely need to look up if you've never heard of this piece before. Because what it involves is 4 string players of a typical string quartet, all individually getting in their own helicopters, flying up in the air, oftentimes circling around whatever performance venue the people have decided to gather at for the day, circling around that in their helicopters, all up in the air, playing this really weird sounding music. They've all got earpieces so that they can do their best to hear each other, because of course they all have to be hooked up to recording equipment, otherwise this would literally never work. And the audience is all down on the ground, and then you've got a sound engineer at the soundboard mixing all of these sounds together so that they can create something that the audience can actually listen to. So why? Why is this created? Why is this a thing? Like, why? Well, apparently, according to Stockhausen himself, the whole idea of specifically the helicopters had something to do with a dream he had at one point about imagining this music coming from these helicopters. But the reason why this piece is often considered important, weird as it is the idea if it pushes those boundaries of what can we consider music. Because if you think about it, if it was just 4 string players on the ground in a performance hall just playing this music, it would not sound the same as if they were in the helicopters. It's a pretty obvious answer, but it does leave you with the thought of it's not the same thing, so therefore it wouldn't be the same piece of music. So therefore, to a certain extent, the helicopters are just as much as part of the music as the strings are, because they're adding this new layer of sound in. So overall, those are 5 pieces that have always really stuck out to me in terms of they're really weird, but they're really unique, and they kind of leave you with something to think about and discuss. So if you have any comments on any of these pieces, if you have any kind of thoughts you'd like to add, please leave them in the comments down below, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. You know, do you think that some of these are considered music? Do you think some of these aren't considered music? Do you think the elements that were used in these pieces should be considered part of the instrumentation? Or do you think that it's just still really weird and it doesn't make sense? And honestly, all of that's okay. I mean, some of these pieces, especially like that helicopter one, I still think is a very weird piece. And I'm still not entirely sure why he thought that was a good idea in the first place. And of course, if you like this content and you'd like to see more of it, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye! No! You spilled the tea! No! You have to clean it up. Oh! Oh my gosh, so many interruptions. You gonna burp? Are we gonna burp? No, it's not. Okay. Well, yeah. I'm just gonna go for it.